The coronavirus has exposed a potentially serious vulnerability in the nation's drug supply. It relies on overseas factories for some of the key ingredients of vital medications.
If you're sick and need a medicine, you should be able to trust that that medication is going to work for you, and you shouldn't have to worry if it's going to be available.
Erin Fox has been tracking drug shortages for nearly 2 decades. She says right now there are shortages of some 240 drugs in the U.S. The concern with coronavirus relates to Chinese-made active pharmaceutical ingredients, or APIs.
Drugs that are used inside the United States, about 30% of the API is coming from Europe, and then the rest is split between India and China. And so really the majority of product is outside the U.S.
While pharmaceutical manufacturers are required by law to report shortages of prescription drugs to the Food and Drug Administration, makers of the ingredients used in those drugs don't have to. So if factory shutdowns overseas lead to drug shortages here because the API makers don't have to disclose those problems, U.S. officials might not know until it's too late.
What we've identified through this episode is a critical choke point in the supply chain for pharmaceuticals and some critical pharmaceuticals.
The FDA has said it is, quote, keenly aware that the outbreak will likely affect the medical product supply chain, including potential disruptions to suppliers and shortages of critical medical products in the U.S. The FDA told Newsy since January 24th it's contacted over 180 manufacturers and reminded them they're required to notify the FDA of any anticipated supply disruptions. The FDA has also identified approximately 20 drugs whose active ingredients or finished products are solely sourced in China.
The FDA has said that this will likely impact the medical product supply chain. And if something like that were to happen, how far out is that, or how soon is that?
I think it depends on where they are in their manufacturing cycle, because they'll have some material on hand. They might have 3 months on hand, they might have 6 months on hand.
How does that start to affect drug prices? Does the price go up? Will it eventually go back down?
Sometimes prices do go up after shortages, but medicines aren't really a typical commodity that supply and demand works for.
Some solutions are out there. U.S. Senators Susan Collins and Tina Smith introduced a bill which would require API manufacturers report interruptions or shortages the same way drug makers do. And sometimes there are workarounds for patients, like substituting medication, but that's not always the case.
There are things like certain chemotherapy drugs that you need a specific drug for a specific indication or reason. And so if that drug is not being manufactured or is being, doled out based on patient need or patient severity, that could be, life-altering and potentially deadly for a patient.
Experts Newsy spoke with say if the supply chain does limit the availability of drugs, U.S. markets could see shortages anywhere between 2 weeks and 6 months from now, depending on how long factory shutdowns last in China.